A major news entity basically laid it out that Marvel is about to collapse. The business is nearly over, and the shares are going to plummet. Wait a minute, you say, the shares. Isn't Marvel part of Disney? Are you talking about Disney shares? No, I'm talking about Marvel's. And actually, I'm talking about 1992, not today. So, what happened? Hey everybody, this is Perch, and I came to the weird conclusion today. So let me back up a second. There used to be this thing called the Comic Buyer's Guide, and it was I believe, weekly newsletter, and it would have various comic information news. But one of my favorite parts of it was a column called "But I Digress" by Peter David. And in that, Peter David would show up regularly. I mean, most people are impressed, like he's writing a comic, he's doing all this other work, and yet he's doing this column like every week, and the long columns, like 2 pages in tiny type. I mean, it was a decent blog that was happening every week. And his main mission seemed to be to pick up things that were being talked about in an inaccurate way or being described and with no knowledge of history, and kind of try to provide some context that maybe things weren't as disastrous or amazing as these kind of two polarized sides would. He's me. I'm him. I'm looking through. I just got a book from somebody very nice, sent me a book that collected a bunch of his old articles. I'm reading through them. I'm like, oh, I remember this. I remember that. I remember this. Oh crap, it's me. I have taken this dumb mantle. Damn it! I'm going to be complaining about tracing next. Stay tuned for an upcoming video about Greg Land, who ironically is now working with Peter David in the Symbiote Spider-Man. Anyway, for those of you who read that article, Peter David pissed off a bunch of artists in the industry by pointing out the various places where they were swiping, particularly a lot of the Image guys. I think Liefeld and Larson in particular, here's the original, and here's the work they did. And it was like clearly influenced. And then that started up a whole debate about, what's an homage versus swiping. It was quite a time. At any rate, I'm going to bring more of these up because in reading through it's just a treasure trove of information. And in this particular one, this is March of 1992. There is a magazine called Barron's, which was a weekly financial newspaper, not magazine, newspaper, and it would talk about investments, and it was a big deal. And kind of think of that as the early 90s version of Jim Cramer. They would basically cite what's coming and going with stock. Now, Marvel at the time is a publicly traded company. It's 92, so they are about 5 years away, 4 years and a half in change from bankruptcy. So aspects of this article and several other articles being written about this time were accurate, that Marvel did have some problems and everything else. But the fascinating part of it is the original articles were talking about how Marvel had no ideas. And they were, basically that there were big problems. And in fact, in the article, a big kind of piece of it is about talking to retailers. So basically, it's 1992, and the article writer interviewed about a dozen or so retailers, and the retailers all said that Marvel had no future, that the world was about to collapse, that they wouldn't be in business, and their big complaints were the price of Marvel Comics, that $1.25 was way too expensive. Can you believe this $1.25? They're pricing their way out of the market. And that they were over-ordering because Marvel was basically promoting things, that weren't going to sell. They had too much back stock, and creatively, they were nowhere near as interesting as independent comics. Does any of this stuff sound perhaps a little bit familiar? It's 18 years in the past. Wait a minute. No, it's 28. Good God. It's 28 years in the past these comments are made. And I think the first thing I draw to your conclusion is, some of this stuff sounds kind of familiar. But Marvel's still ticking, and Marvel also maybe has some problems. It's interesting how that works. But at any rate, it's Peter David writes, what boils down to it is that many retailers simply don't like Marvel Comics. They don't like the title they're publishing or the company policies. Retailers would tell me that they hated ordering crossover titles or yet another mutant title, even if the books were selling for them. Retailers would also tell me that they would always recommend titles by independents to their customers because they were the retailer's personal favorites, and as far as those retailers were concerned, those were the books that should be pushed. And the guy from Barron's basically drew the conclusion that the retailers know something about their market that Marvel doesn't, and therefore Marvel was in deep trouble. And then he points out, again, quoting Peter David here, he shores up his finding with facts that are misleading and contradictory. For example, he states that Marvel is in trouble because consumers are no longer willing to keep shelling out anywhere from $1.50 to $2.95 for a comic book. He does not point out, or maybe simply unaware, that the majority of Marvel titles are in fact $1.25, including such top seeds as X-Men and X-Force. It is in fact the independents which generally start at $1.75 and up, prices dictated by lower print runs. Anyway, it's an interesting article, and it is on brand for Peter David, who just goes through and massacres kind of each and every point. What's interesting is that he is and now in hindsight, of course, we see how things played out. Marvel, of course, was in trouble, but it wasn't for any of the reasons that Barron's was citing. And I think, again, it's a fascinating parallel to today, where there's a lot of articles being written, a lot of YouTube videos, a lot of other things where they talk about Marvel being in a desperate position, Marvel being on the brink of collapse and everything else, but rarely for the actual reasons the danger is coming from. Back in the 90s, it was about the price, which, unlike today, was actually not terrible. He's talking about solicitations, which again, back in the day was dramatically better than today. I'd love to talk to some of these retailers now 28 years later and be like, how do you like it now? But at any rate, but what he doesn't come in for, this is the most striking part. Barron's predicts bleak futures for Marvel's licensing side. Marvel has recently made tremendous strides in licensing, finally getting out action figures and playsets, whereas DC had such toys available years ago. Yet this is a negative, claiming oversaturation. So the interesting thing that we found was oversaturation was not the problem. In fact, in the licensing side, most of Marvel's toys and all that kind of third-party stuff was underserved through the 90s. There was more demand than there was product. That was true. Now, Toy Biz, which Marvel then purchased, definitely had some troubles, but that was from not having too much product, but completely mismanaging that part of the business. And what's interesting is, because I read Peter David's article, I read Barron's article, neither Peter David nor Barron really talked about the problem that was existing, which was Marvel was buying up all kinds of different companies in the 90s, trading card companies, toy companies, a little music company, all this stuff. And they didn't know what to do with it. Yeah, Heroes World, they were buying these properties up as acquisitions, but had no idea of actually how to capitalize or run those parts of the business. They were overcommitting themselves, yes, but not for product, for competence. They just didn't have the ability to actually manage these things. And in many ways, if I can go even further back, you might argue, and some people will dislike this point I'm about to draw, but Jim Shooter in the 80s was really big on expansion of the comics into new markets, expansion of all kinds of expansion. In many ways, what happened in the 90s was taking his lead, but without any intelligence behind it. Meaning Marvel did try and expand. Marvel did try and acquire and buy new things and get into more and more and more. The problem was they didn't know what to do with the stuff they expanded into. And so it was really like they were trying to still run by kind of Shooter's playbook, but with nobody who really had any intelligence or understanding of what they were trying to do. It's interesting. It's fascinating to me because as Peter David goes through and just very effectively massacres the article, for example, one thing in the entire Barron's group that was predicting a bleak future for Marvel was they didn't mention at all the animated series at the time. And the X-Men animated show that ran on Fox was actually highly successful. The problem was completely that the market was stretched. And here is an even more fascinating part of the article. Now check this out. Cass is the writer for Barron's, states that Marvel is vulnerable because 3 privately held distributors account for more than 50% of publishing revenues, and that if any of them hit financial problems, Marvel could have difficulties. Who knew, right? Okay, that is true. Did he contact Capital City to find out if they're having difficulties with receivables? Is there an indication that Diamond is flawed? Nope, just more what ifs. And if Toys R Us went belly up, then Hasbro and Kenner would be in trouble. This article is fascinating because it's many of the things that Peter David is saying are not problems. He is largely correct. In 92, they weren't problems. And this guy was writing this kind of panicky article saying they were, but there wasn't any proof or evidence of that. Fast forward 28 years later, and most of these things were deeply problematic. Here's this part. The direct market is a negative to Mr. Cass. Nearly 80% of publishing revenues, he claims, are derived from the direct market. Now, this is good. Sales to the direct market are inherently more economical and profitable for publishers because it means they can print exactly what they can sell. Minimum effort for maximum profits as opposed to print 3, sell 1, existent in the returnable market. But no, Mr. Cass claims this is bad because, in essence, there's a recession on and retailers are vulnerable. Of course they are. Everyone is. No one ever claimed that Marvel is recession-proof. Nothing is recession-proof. So why are we singling out Marvel? It's just a head-spinning article. So on many different fronts, and I'll put the link in here, including kind of this long segment on Barron's saying that the collector market was waning and dying. And what we learned was, of course, the collector market is arguably, now, collector market, not speculator market. The collector market is largely, I think, what saved Marvel and DC and a lot of these companies through the late 90s, because there's those people who didn't leave the party when the speculators all did. Today, the collector market is extremely dodgy because the publishers have worked so hard to dismantle it. It's fast. I don't even know where to begin with this. All this stuff. This would be great live stream material, but it's just fascinating how this all goes. But the big lesson for me is, yes, back in 1992, there were people saying kind of inaccurate, crazy, highly speculative things, and good old Peter David was over there in in this thing, putting out article after article, kind of debunking this stuff into the wind. Because it was funny, a lot of creators and people in the industry came to hate Peter David through this process. I mean, in part because he directly started to troll them, but just a fascinating sequence of events. I don't know. Marvel, of course, in history would go on to suffer severe financial problems, declare bankruptcy, and everything else. One little note at the top, and I'll leave with this, was that the Barron's article did reveal a little bit, well, two last things. Sorry, I lied. So first, it revealed where a lot of the money was going, where the money from the stockholders was actually going at the time. And it was going to Ron Perlman, financier Ron Perlman, who, go figure, there's a whole video on that guy at some point. But yeah, the amount of money that went into his pocket during that period was insane, of course. And of course, the aftermath was also insane. But the last thing I'll mention is, and it's now 28 years later, 28 years. I'm sure there's people listening to this video, many who were not born during this time. This article by Barron used a ton of sound effects like pow and smash and kapow and biff. And this is one of those things that I absolutely have always hated. Whenever the mainstream media covers comics, for whatever reason, some dumbass wants to insert kind of sound effects from the Adam West Batman into the article as a way to spice it up, give it color. I have no idea what they're doing. But I'm just curious if any people listening to this right now absolutely hate that. Like when you're doing an article, it's like, and then it was like, kapow, comics hit the scene, blammo, they were big sales. It's like, you sound like so much cringe. I'm just so much. Anyway, it's a fascinating article. I've got a couple questions for you. One, does anybody remember this whole But I Digress column that was in Comics Buyer's Guide by Peter David? Two, crap, it's me. And three, just kind of, I wanted to mainly illustrate for you how it is interesting how people can look at a situation, accurately predict that problems are coming, but give all the wrong reasons. as to why. And it makes me wonder, because as a follow-up to this article came out, a bunch of other financial institutions jumped on it, and people were kind of talking about this stuff with Marvel. And the way it played out was definitely not what was predicted. But of course, disaster did happen. So you might argue that, if you were bear and you're like, well, I didn't get the reasons why, but I got the result correct. So, no harm, no foul. Except if we look at Marvel, and in particular their moves from the late 90s to even like today, there's a lot of things they did that were in response to what people said the problems were, but were not actually the problems, like changing how the collector's market worked, like going all in on variants and other pricing schemes that are identified as Marvel leaving money on the table, but arguably are causing a new problem today. This is one of those, like, those who don't learn from history, it's not just are doomed to repeat it, are doomed to screw up in new and fascinating ways. I don't know. I don't know. Fascinating time. Anyway, hey everybody, leave a comment below what you think of all this. Sorry, it's a bit rambly, but man, I'm blown away. Like, subscribe, follow me on social media, send me an email at comicsperch@gmail.com, and thanks for listening.